So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left off, Georgia Purdom, one of Vanish's and Genesis pet genetics PhDs, was lying about molecular clocks and how long ago mitochondrial Eve lived. Now she's going to lie about other topics in genetics, and I say she's lying both because I have direct evidence that she lied about sources in the last section, but also because she absolutely knows better as a person with an advanced degree in this topic. Anyway, here's Georgia on my CRT TV because this was uploaded in potato resolution.
Does a human chromosome 2 fusion event support human chimp ancestry?
Yes, it does. If you liked this video, please hit like and let me know what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, hit dislike, and either way, let me know what the problem was. Either way, I hope you subscribe and check out the channel memberships and my Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members,
This is by far becoming
especially those pledging $20 or above.
the most asked question
Benthovend, Tapioca Weasel.
that I receive, so we need to deal with that.
That means I need to deal with it too. Well, here we go.
First of all, the facts. Humans have 46 chromosomes. That is a fact.
That's true.
Unless you count the mitochondrial genome, which I don't, and neither do most people.
Chimps have 48 chromosomes. That is also a fact.
It's not just chimps. All the other hominids, orangutans, gorillas, and bonobos do as well.
Banding patterns in DNA sequences on human chromosome 2 are very similar to what we find on chimp chromosomes 12 and 13.
That's true.
In fact, they're basically identical in banding patterns, but also in actual sequence when we go in and sequence the individual nucleotides.
In fact, so much so, and because of people's evolutionary presuppositions, they have renamed chimp chromosome 12 and 13 to 2A and 2B.
Well, since they have the same genes and functions for the most part as human chromosome 2, and since cross-species comparisons are a big thing, that just makes everything more convenient for everyone. And Georgia can cry about it if she likes, but I don't care, neither should you.
Okay, to reflect the fact that we supposedly diverged from them.
I actually want to give her props here. It is correct that humans diverged from chimps and bonobos, and it is not correct that humans descended from chimps and bonobos. The common ancestor of that triad was not a chimp, a human, or a bonobo. All of them descended from a human-like ancestor that lived in the then nearly continuous forests of Africa some 6 to 7 million years ago. The ancestors of chimps and bonobos stuck to the forests that started to shrink as a result of the climate becoming more arid as the world cooled. And the ancestors of humans were those apes that struck out into the newly forming grasslands.
And there's no doubt about it that the human and chimp chromosomes are very, very similar to one another. In fact, if you look here, this is human, chimp, gorilla, and orangutan. And if you look at the human and chimp, this is human chromosome 2 and 12 and 13 for the chimp.
2A and 2B.
You will see they're very, very similar in their banding pattern. If you look at the sequence, it's very, very similar.
So, since genetic similarities like this are exactly the kind of thing we do with things like paternity tests or forensic testing to find the family members of victims or perpetrators in the case of criminality, or finding out who the modern relatives of human remains in archaeological contexts are, we all accept that the degree of genetic similarity indicates the degree of relatedness. And the question I have for creationists is, where does that rule of similarity implying relatedness stop? And how do you know?
No one can deny that, really.
Yes, they can, especially now where the Department of Homeland Security in the now-defunct United States of America is just openly and brazenly lying about their murder victims. You can deny whatever you want. For the sake of clarity, this is being written on the morning of January 28th, 2026, so yeah, we're in a post-truth world, which I'm sure Georgia and her co-conspirators at AIG absolutely love. What they don't love is that they're rats in a financially sinking ship with no clear path forward, but I suppose I appreciate that she's not going to deny this. Although I do wonder how she makes the distinction between which science she will deny and which she won't. Because she's a science denier right up there with people like Eric Dubé, Andrew Wakefield, Eric von Daniken, and the rest. If you think you have an idea as to her criteria for accepting or rejecting some aspects of science, put it in the comments.
Now, some more facts on this. If you look at human chromosome 2, right in the middle of the chromosome, you will see a couple interesting things.
Is she saying chromosome with an N?
You'll see remnants of what are called centromeric DNA.
No, you'll find remnants of telomeric DNA. Georgia is lying again. What you'll find in terms of centromere DNA is that chromosome 2 has two sections of centromeric DNA, one section that is defunct and another section that actually operates as a centromere. The middle of the chromosome has a defunct region of telomeric DNA. Telomeres are sort of the end caps of a chromosome, and having them in the middle of a chromosome along with two centromere regions is a smoking gun for chromosome fusion.
Now, in the middle of a chromosome,
Yep, she's definitely saying chromosome. Is pronouncing things wrong like a identity marker for creationists? We have so many of them saying the word genome like genome, and now we have chromosome. At least with evidences, I get that it's a formerly standard use that didn't fall away in Christian apologetics writing. But what is the deal with this?
you have a special kind of DNA called centromeric DNA. And human chromosome 2 not only has its one centromere, but it has remnants of another one.
Ah, so she is correcting this. I still object to how she characterized it before because I think it obscured the fact that we do in fact have telomeric DNA in the middle of the chromosome, but whatever.
It looks like there might be another one there. And also in the middle, you have telomeric DNA. Now,
Well, okay then, I guess we got there. Weird way to get there, but let's see how she explains away the conclusive evidence that human chromosome 2 is in fact a fusion, and that it's a fusion of two chromosomes that are nearly identical to two separate chromosomes in other apes.
that's interesting because telomeric DNA is only found on the ends of the chromosome. It's not found in the middle, but yet on human chromosome 2, you find some of that right in the middle.
It's not just interesting, I'd say it's devastating to the entire idea of young Earth creationism. Is Georgia just doing my job for me, albeit badly? Thanks, I guess?
So what it looks like is that two chromosomes have come together and fused, at least superficially speaking. That's what it looks like.
Superficially speaking? How could it look like at any deeper level? The actual genetic sequence is indicative of a fusion. Is there some deeper level that we should be looking at? I don't think so. Does Georgia even know what the word superficial means? It means on the surface. I would argue that superficially, chromosome 2 doesn't look like much at all, and it's only at the deeper levels of analysis that we see the evidence of fusion. Also, just as a quick reminder, if you could like this video and maybe share it with some of your friends, it would really help out. YouTube has been unkind to many creators I know, not just me, and we could really use your help. Every day, thousands of slop videos go up and compete with real creators like me. We can't fight for eyeballs on our own. The only way to keep not just this channel, but this platform alive is if you tell the algorithm that the channels you like are the ones like this one, with a real person behind them handcrafting videos, not some plagiarism machine that doesn't even know what a hand is.
So in fact, human chromosome 2 may have resulted from the fusion of two chromosomes.
Interesting admission. Even today, I usually hear creationists coming up with all sorts of excuses as to why it's not a real fusion.
And so many people love this. They think this is great because, chimps have 48 and we have 46. So if you're going to evolve from a chimp,
Earlier she got this right. Why the regression now? The ancestors of chimps and bonobos stuck to the forests that started to shrink as a result of the climate becoming more arid as the world cooled. And the ancestors of humans were those apes that struck out into the newly forming grasslands.
you got to lose chromosomes. You got to lose information.
Did Georgia just say that information is just chromosome number? Oh, I'm sorry, chromosome number? So anytime a chromosome splits, that's new information. We've observed that many times, so I guess we've observed information being added to the genome. Of course, what this phrasing implies is that a chromosome was deleted, but no, it fused. The ape chromosome 2A and 2B became a single larger chromosome 2 in humans, and there was no loss of genetic material. So if you think that information is actually just the genome sequence, then there wasn't any real loss of information at all. As a side note, her repeated mispronunciation of the word chromosome is starting to drive me a little crazy. How does she have a PhD in genetics and not know that there's no N in chromosome?
And so what they think is that chimp chromosome 12 and 13 fused to form human chromosome 2.
No, they don't. They think that the ancestral ape chromosomes 2A and 2B fused. Chimps have nothing to do with it because they diverged from humans before this event happened. Chimps are not the ancestors of humans. No one in evolutionary biology thinks that they are. They share a common ancestor with humans. Chimps are not the ancestors of humans. Anyone who says humans evolved from chimps doesn't know what they're talking about or is lying. Chimps are not the ancestors of humans. I hope I've made myself clear on the fact that chimps are not the ancestors of humans.
And many evolutionists say that this is proof of common ancestry.
I feel like they don't, because science doesn't deal in proof. What it is, though, is a confirmed prediction. Remember, we have not been able to sequence DNA for all that long, but getting basic chromosome karyotypes has been an option for much longer. And so humans have known for a long time that other apes have an extra chromosome in their haploid chromosome count compared to humans. So, the hypothesis was put forward that one chromosome in humans is probably the result of a chromosome fusion that occurred in the human lineage at some point. So when basic tests were performed, that result in that banding that Georgia showed earlier was the first vindication of this hypothesis. Because we found that one human chromosome looked like two chromosomes in other apes, just smushed together from head to head, as predicted. Then, when we started to be able to actually sequence DNA and we found out about centromeres and telomeres, the immediate prediction was that if chromosome 2 really is a fusion of two ancestral chromosomes, then we should see two centromere regions, a defunct telomere region in the middle, and the same genes as are found on the homologous chromosomes in other apes. And lo and behold, that's another confirmed prediction. On the other hand, no such predictions were forthcoming from creationists because special creation has no way to make such a prediction. I've been informed by creationists repeatedly that confirmed predictions are the gold standard in science. And guess what? We have repeated confirmed predictions about chromosome 2 based on evolutionary biology. This is not just evidence of common ancestry, it's conclusive evidence of it when taken along with the rest of the evidence. Any argument against human common ancestry with other apes has not a single leg to stand on.
Absolute proof that we diverged from a chimp.
No, again, not absolute proof, but evidence that is sufficient to demonstrate it beyond a reasonable doubt. The only reason to doubt human common ancestry with chimps, not descent from them, as Georgia keeps lying about, is perversity. Which I guess makes Georgia a pervert. That's neat.
In fact, Dr. Ken Miller, who is a well-known theistic evolutionist, recently had this to say: "Is there any question to explain these facts? And these are facts. This is not hypothesis or conjecture, the fact that human chromosome 2 is similar to chimp chromosome 12 and 13. Any way to explain these facts in light of the view that our species was uniquely designed or intelligently created? The answer is no."
I actually disagree. We could argue that God is just a liar who arranged the whole world to look like it's old and that evolution occurred. Now, I think that's a bad argument to make for epistemological reasons, but you can make it. That being said, I have no issue with theistic evolutionists. They're not denying science by having that position, and it's the only tenable theistic option that doesn't involve a divine trickster that makes knowledge impossible.
You can only explain this by evolutionary common ancestry.
Or a deceitful designer.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful term to use, only. Unfortunately, what Dr. Miller and many other evolutionists don't realize is they have committed a logical fallacy with their argument.
Ooh, I wonder which one. Affirming the consequent? Reification? Ad hominem? Begging the question? Post hoc ergo propter hoc? Hasty generalization? Pause the video and put your guesses in the comments.
So we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to point that out.
Just name the damn fallacy.
And one of the biggest logical fallacies that I see committed, and you're going to see this several times today, is that of affirming the consequent.
Ooh, nice. If you guessed affirming the consequent, you win 3 internets. The argument goes, if P then Q, Q therefore P. It is a formal logical fallacy. But here's the problem. Science isn't concerned with formal logic and syllogisms. Science is built on empiricism, collecting data and statistics. If it were built on formal logic, then it would actually prove things. But importantly, nothing that is proved would be proved about the real world. Just about ideas that we have in isolation that may or may not apply to the real world. At any given step in the scientific process, if you take one single data point and look at the conclusion it is being used to support, it can look like affirming the consequent. For example, if Newton and Kepler's laws are true, then the planet Neptune must exist to explain the irregularities in the orbit of Uranus. We look, and sure enough, there's Neptune. Prediction confirmed. Does that prove Kepler and Newton right? No. But what it does is add confidence. Every confirmed prediction adds confidence. It doesn't prove anything. That's not the point. So while if P then Q, Q therefore P is fallacious, science operates like if P then Q, Q thousands of times, never contradicting P, therefore probably P. And eventually, the probability of P gets high enough that it makes no sense to withhold assent to the proposition P. Complaining about this is just complaining about science as a whole, and it's a sign that Georgia isn't just a pseudoscientist or a science denier, she's anti-science. She hates science from the very ground up. She wants it to end.
They say, well, if humans and chimps share a common ancestor, then we should observe a fusion event. Human chromosome 2 shows evidence of a fusion event. Therefore, humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
Nope. Therefore, that increases our confidence, and further, it's not just that one prediction. I already broke this down earlier into individual predictions. There is also the fact that we can use separate ancestry as our null hypothesis, and its predictions fail over and over and over, which means that the alternative can't reasonably be true. So we're left with P1, therefore Q1, Q1 thousands of times, P2, therefore Q2, never Q2, so the weight of evidence is squarely on the side of P1. This isn't a formal logical argument, because that's not what science does. This is like complaining that your car is really bad at transmitting TV signals over the radio waves. Yeah, it was never supposed to do that. That's not what it's about, what it's for, or why it exists. Science is not here to make syllogistic arguments, but statistical ones. It is only the complete inability of creationists to actually provide statistical evidence for their ideas that forces them into this pathetic retreat into formal logic in a field that doesn't really care about it for the most part. Also, of course, Georgia is herself risking the fallacy, which is an informal fallacy where the argument is that because an argument for a conclusion is fallacious, the conclusion is false. That's not true. For example, I could say that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States because on Tuesday I ate tuna and rice. Obviously, that's a non sequitur. But it's still true that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. And pointing out that my argument is nonsensical doesn't change that.
Okay, let me put this in other terms. If the grass is wet, then it must have rained. The grass is wet. Therefore, it must have rained. But the grass could be wet for any number of reasons, okay? It doesn't have to be rain, right? You can take your hose and spray the grass with it. It doesn't have to be rain.
Right, those are alternative hypotheses. And in science, what we do is we check those. So we look and find that there are no hoses near enough the grass in question to wet it. We check surveillance footage and find that no one was near enough to have dumped water on the grass, and no animals of sufficient size were close enough for them to have urinated so much as to account for the wetness of the grass. We can check for corroborating evidence, like weather radar that showed indications associated with rain, eyewitness accounts of rain, etc. Then finally, we can conclude, with high confidence, but not 100% confidence, that the wet grass is because of rain. That's how science works. We don't just say, well, if X is true, I think it's because Y, and then leave it at that. Human common ancestry with chimps is also supported by shared ERVs, shared genetic sequences, including pseudogenes, homologous structures, and all the other bits of evidence that support universal ancestry broadly. The chromosome 2 fusion is just the nail in the coffin. After all, a fusion on its own isn't much, but why would it be a fusion of 2 ape chromosomes? In fact, why would humans have ape chromosomes at all?
And the same thing is here. Just because human chromosome 2 may be the result of a fusion event,
which it is, because the alternative options hold no water, while the predictions of the fusion event hypothesis have been repeatedly confirmed,
doesn't mean that humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
On its own, in isolation, no, it's not proof. But when combined with the rest of the evidence, it is indeed evidence that is conclusive. This argument from Georgia amounts to just, nuh-uh, science is dumb. And if that's the best argument she has, that's far more pathetic than I expected.
Okay, that's a logical fallacy.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
Casey Luskin,
noted fascist,
who is a member of the intelligent design movement, I think really stated this well, referring to Ken Miller's arguments on this. He said this: evidence for fusion in a human chromosome tells you little to nothing about whether humans share a common ancestor with living apes.
Well, that's dumb, since that's the only hypothesis that actually accounts for the data. That's up there with oxidation really telling you very little about fire.
The human chromosomal fusion argument focuses on a fusion event that is specific to the human line, and therefore provides a highly limited form of evidence for human-ape common ancestry.
Yeah, and if the chromosome weren't specifically an obvious fusion of 2 ape chromosomes that occur in other apes, it would be a weak argument. In fact, it would probably be an indication of a lack of common ancestry. It's not just that there is a fusion, it's that it's an obvious fusion of 2 homologous chromosomes in other apes. Casey knows this. He's just a Nazi liar. And if you're wondering why I say that, it's because the organization he helps lead was part of drafting Project 2025, which is a neo-fascist game plan for the takeover of what's left of the United States. If you want a place where you can discuss both science and the rise of fascism in the former United States, or you just want me to be able to keep making videos here, why not join my Patreon? The link is in the description, and you get a 15% discount for a year-long pledge. You also get early access to videos like this one, as well as access to my Discord server that's just for supporters.
So he said, basically, even if humans diverged from chimps, okay, this happened once they were already on their own, okay, not back in the common ancestor.
Right, but why is there a fusion between homologous chromosomes in humans that match ape chromosomes at all if there was no common ancestry? The only option I can see is that the creator just made human genetics look like they're the result of an evolutionary process that includes recent common ancestry with chimpanzees and bonobos.
Because again, chimps still have 48 and we have 46. So it happened somewhere after we diverged.
Yeah? And?
Now, of course, from a biblical creationist standpoint, we would say there can be no evidence for shared ancestry because, again, God's word makes it clear that chimps and humans are in no way related. They were separate creation.
In other words, Georgia doesn't care what the evidence says. She has picked her conclusion and nothing can prove her wrong. It's hard to imagine a less intellectually honest position that one could take. Right here, she just admitted that she doesn't care about evidence, reason, truth, or anything else. She has decided that she will believe something, no matter how wrong it might be. I, as someone who cares about science and truth, which you can see because I don't put the word truth in my username, think this is a reprehensible attitude.
So Luskin goes on to say, all Miller has done is documented direct empirical evidence of a chromosomal fusion event in the human line. But evidence for a chromosomal fusion event is not evidence for when that took place, nor is it evidence for the ancestry prior to that event. It doesn't tell you when it happened. It doesn't tell you what was going on before it happened.
I agree that it doesn't tell us when it happened, but it tells us that before it happened, human genetics were even more similar to the genetics of other apes than they are now, which is already more similar to some apes than others, putting humans squarely in the ape family, and that genetic divergence going forward in time and convergence going back in time is a core prediction of evolution, which means this is indeed evidence of evolution broadly and of human evolution specifically.
And so, again, it's very much historical origin science, so our presuppositions play a huge, huge role.
And the presuppositions of science are that past experience can inform future experience, which lets us make predictions about future data based on past data, and the immutability of nature across time and space, that is, that the universe operates according to consistent principles that do not vary from one time to another or from one place to another. Really, though, those are the same presupposition. Science does not presume that God does not exist, although it isn't interested in the question and can't really investigate the question. This is why theists, atheists, and agnostics can all do good science.
What is our starting point?
The objective existence of an external world and empiricism.
Man's ideas about the past or God's ideas about the past and what God's word says.
Well, again, all we actually have are the words of men in the broad sense and evidence. The evidence points towards common ancestry in deep time. The words of men are contradictory and often not in agreement with the evidence.
It makes a big difference. And in fact, even those in the evolutionary community realize the problems with equating molecular similarity to evolutionary relationships, that if we're really similar, well, we must diverge from one another.
Ooh, is she about to do a bait and switch between similar proteins and similar genetics, ignoring that more than one genetic sequence can produce identical proteins, and that since proteins are shaped by selection, two organisms can converge on the same protein while having quite different genetics underlying that? And she's going to ignore that we can detect molecular convergence as separate from molecular divergence?
And these next scientists, I'm going to quote, think orangutans are more closely related to humans than chimps.
In the past, that was not actually a completely bonkers take. Morphologically, there are a lot of similarities with orangutans. Now it turns out that a lot of that is due to humans and orangs retaining basal characteristics like hand shape that gorillas and members of genus Pan have lost as they became more derived. But genetic studies have put that one to bed. But sure, let's see why it is that Georgia is dredging up some sources about morphological studies that have linked two closely related organisms to the exclusion of other groups, when it turns out that more careful study, more recently, has ruled out that option hypothesized in her studies.
And they said this, Schwartz and Grierhan contend that the clear physical similarities between humans and orangutans have long been overshadowed by molecular analyses that link humans to chimpanzees, but that those molecular comparisons are often flawed.
So this is pulled from a creationist article, and it references a PopSci article on phys.org. The article itself is just reporting on a paper from 2009 by John R. Gran and Jeffrey H. Schwartz.
I see your Schwartz is as big as mine.
It is titled Evolution of the Second Orangutan, Phylogeny and Biogeography of Hominid Origins. It has 88 citations, and unsurprisingly, it has not been received well. which even prompted the same authors to write a response to such critiques in 2011 with the paper Evolution of Human-Ape Relationships Remain Open for Investigation, wherein the authors more or less whine that no one takes them seriously, and then show that if you include traits that most scientists say aren't helpful to the analysis, then you can make the data fit their conclusion. Interestingly, their rejection of the molecular data amounts to, well, people say that degrees of relatedness is reflected in degree of genetic similarity, but what if nuh-uh? To which it seems the basic response from more or less everyone is, genomes are what is inherited from ancestors. There's not really any possibility that that fails to correlate to ancestry, and further, their analysis of morphological characters of apes, which is the basis for their conclusion, has not held up in the past 17 years or so. It is also noteworthy that these papers were published in the Journal of Biogeography and not an evolutionary biology journal, or one about physical anthropology. They do include biogeographical analysis, but it also means that the evolutionary claims were probably not submitted to as much scrutiny during peer review as they should have been. Ultimately, though, this just shows that contrary to creationists whining about censorship, you're allowed to make a case for a non-standard and, frankly, even a crazy hypothesis in the scientific literature, as long as you've actually done work to support your conclusion. Sure, you're probably still going to be wrong, but you won't be censored.
There is no theory holding that molecular similarity necessarily implies an evolutionary relationship.
Except, what genetics is. And of course, we're not even reading from the paper. We're reading from the Pop Sci article. Why would Georgia actually bother citing the real source when she can look at a summary that doesn't actually give the paper's arguments in any detail, and which makes it harder for people to check up on, since the article didn't have a link to the paper? Like, the theory is literally the same as what undergirds things like paternity tests or forensic genetic testing to identify victims and perpetrators based on familial relationships. If Grant and Schwartz want to say otherwise, then I make the same challenge to them as to creationists. If genetic similarity stops being a reliable indicator of ancestry at some point, where is that point and how do you know? Of course, they won't see this, so they won't answer, but basically, that's the question that the rest of paleoanthropology had for them. They don't seem to have come up with much of an answer.
Even though that's what you hear all the time.
Because it's not actually clear how it even could be otherwise.
And molecular data that contradict the idea that genetic similarity denotes relation are often dismissed.
Right, because it's absurd on the face of it and flies in the face of all data we have about relatedness and genealogical relation, as well as the generally tight correlation between genetics and morphological similarity, barring some outliers.
Which is plain out bad science. They're just going to dismiss it. If it doesn't fit their theory, it's gone.
Which is literally what the authors of the paper she's relying on did with molecular data, and what creationists do continually with virtually all data. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black, except this kettle is actually chrome.
And so they're challenging that. They're saying, you know what? Just because they're molecularly similar doesn't mean that they have a common ancestor.
Actually, no, they're not challenging human-chimp common ancestry. The paper strongly supports that. It just claims that the common ancestor humans share with chimps is less recent than the one they share with orangutans.
It doesn't mean that they have this evolutionary relationship. So even they themselves are questioning this.
But they're not, though. This is like walking into a discussion about whether to change the batting order of a baseball team to account for the handedness of the pitcher, and then deciding that because some people have a different opinion about who should bat in what order, that baseball isn't even a real game, and it's actually a satanic conspiracy to steer you away from God. All that despite the fact that your evidence is actually evidence that baseball is real, even if there are controversies within it, and that it doesn't lead people away from God, and that even if it did, it still wouldn't be fake. Further, I need to remind you, this woman has a PhD in genetics. She knows that the simple fact of parental inheritance combined with what a mutation is in the first place means that it is mathematically required that more closely related individuals and groups be more genetically similar. She's lying to you right now. Think to yourself what it would require for some morphology to be related to common ancestry, but for genomes not to be. It would mean that genomes are not passed down from parent to child, and that genotypes have no correlation to phenotypes. We know both of these things are wrong. If we take this idea seriously, it means everything we know about genetics is wrong, right down to DNA being the molecule of inheritance.
And there's other problems with this as well. If you're going from chimps to humans, and we're supposedly more highly evolved, but this is involving a loss of information.
2 questions. 1, what is information and how do I measure it so as to be able to tell that information has increased or decreased? 2, what about evolution precludes the loss of information in the history of humans?
Okay, when you fuse 2 chromosomes, and it's obvious by looking at this, stuff is gone, okay? You've lost some of the centromere and you've lost some of the telomeres.
Yep, But I don't know if that's a loss of information, because I don't know how information is defined here, or how much of it is in the centromeres and telomeres. In fact, given that those are mostly full of short repeated segments of DNA, and therefore extremely low information in most definitions of information, it's not actually clear that any information is lost. If by information we mean anything like the Shannon information of the original 2 chromosomes in the fused chromosome 2.
And those are very important. They're not junk, even though you see that a lot.
No, you don't. Telomeres and centromeres have a known function and are not junk. Junk is not the same thing as non-coding DNA and never has been, even though creationists love to pretend that they are synonymous in literature.
We'll talk about that a little more later. Some organisms have genes in their centromeres.
Okay, and some people eat beetle larvae. Some dolphins have hind limbs that extend past the body wall. Some moons have volcanoes that shoot water, not lava. What does this have to do with the price of tea in China?
Telomeres are very important in regulating the production from other genes.
Well, that was vague, and I don't know what specifically that means, but okay, I'm just wondering what the point of this is.
So they're very important.
I don't think that's contested.
How do you get from one organism to another organism by losing information?
I assume she means species, and, if we assume that we have a definition for information and that correlates to changes that can cause a loss of a gene flow, then that's how. A change results in a loss of information, which for whatever reason causes a loss of gene flow between populations.
You don't. It's a clear problem that we see over and over again. You need a game.
In this case, if we just assume that a chromosome fusion results in a loss of information, which I do not accept, but am just allowing for the sake of the argument, this causes the chromosomes to no longer match up, and so meiosis is interrupted, resulting in hybrid sterility, like we see in mules. Therefore, the species are now 2 different species. I'm not sure why this would be hard to understand.
And it's not a simple fusion. A lot of people, I saw this one diagram where they literally showed, the 2 chimp chromosomes coming together and boop, forming a fusion. Oh, wow, look at that. And to, a layperson looking at that, they would probably think, wow, yeah, I can see that.
Why? Species have genomes that go down in size, up in size, stay steady. Some species lose genes, like primates who have lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C because of the loss of the gulo gene. Some gain some, like icefish who have evolved novel antifreeze protein genes.
This one was unfortunately used to teach children.
Yeah, and it was probably a simplified depiction for the layperson who doesn't know or care about things like alphoid repeats and telomere-associated pseudogenes and stuff like that.
Because this is what your kids are going to start seeing in their textbooks, and this is what they want teachers to teach.
So I was right. It was highly simplified, and what's unfortunate about that? Children aren't ready for all the complexity of any field, let alone genetics. In what world do we think children are ready for things like the actual intermolecular forces at play, or learning about the exact makeup of histone proteins and methylation, and how that affects heterochromatin or euchromatin?
But it's not a simple fusion. There's a lot of non-alignments, gaps, and what we call translocations, pieces from other chromosomes. It's really mismatched.
What, they want them to teach things that Georgia seems to agree with? She seems to accept that it's a fusion. She just thinks it happened in humans after they were specially created. Or am I not understanding her position? Let me know in the comments if that's not what she's trying to say here, or if I'm getting this right so far.
In fact, there's 150,000 base pairs that are in the human chromosome that aren't in the chimp chromosomes, okay?
Okay, why would that be important for children to learn in detail?
Huge parts are missing. It's not just a simple fusion, so don't be deceived by that, because that's what you see a lot out there on the internet.
This just in, guys. Deletions have occurred in human chromosome 2, more at 11. Seriously, why the fuck is this seen as significant to Georgia? What point is that supposed to help her make? I don't think it's deception to not give every single detail of a fusion of chromosomes when the point being expressed is the uncontroversial point that human chromosome 2 is the result of a fusion event. It's like if I tell you that the Battle of Midway was a naval battle fought over 4 days by the Japanese and US navies in 1942, and was a victory for the USA and started turning the momentum against the Japanese. That's true. It's not deceptive, and yet there is so much more detail. I could account for the action of every ship and aircraft, or even every crew member, pilot, officer, or even every bullet fired. But unless I'm talking to a bunch of hyper-obsessed military history buffs, most of that probably isn't important.
But what can we say about this? Okay, first of all, human chromosome 2 fusion event is not evidence for human chimp ancestry. That is a logical fallacy. Right?
It's not, and Georgia is precariously close to committing the fallacy herself, but whatever.
Just because the grass is wet doesn't mean it rained.
True, but when you eliminate other explanations and have corroborating evidence, and you've repeated this observation many times, it suddenly becomes a pretty good, although never 100% reliable, indicator of rain. Science isn't formal logic. It can't be, it shouldn't be, and it never will be. It's actually far more useful than formal logic. Formal logic won't get you a computer. Only empirical science can do that.
And we're going to keep going back to that, so keep that in mind. All humans have the same chromosome 2, or very similar chromosome 2.
Very similar is more accurate. There is, in fact, diversity on chromosome 2, which I have to remind you was 2 M's and not a single instance of the letter N.
Which supports that we all descended from a common ancestor, okay? Adam and Eve.
No, nothing indicates that humans descended from a single pair. In fact, humans have far too much genetic diversity for that to be a reasonable conclusion. And further, if it were true, then the time to the most recent 4 alleles for virtually all parts of the genome should be the same and come out to about 6,000 years ago. Spoiler alert, they don't.
There's disagreement, however, as to whether chromosome 2 is a result of a fusion event.
In the same way that there's disagreement about the shape of the world. There is the overwhelming evidence and consensus that it's a globe or a fusion, and then there are a few quacks, idiots, and frauds who think it's flat or not a fusion.
People are still investigating this. Creationists are looking at this. Evolutionists are still looking at this. We don't really know for sure even if it's actual fusion of 2 chromosomes at some point in the past.
We do, though. It has head-to-head telomere regions in the middle, 2 centromeres, and it contains the genes that in other apes are on chromosomes 2A and 2B in the place expected if the chromosome is a fusion of those. There is literally no reason to think otherwise. We're at about the same level of certainty as we are that helium has only 2 protons, or that the Earth is a globe. The only reason to reject it at this rate is perversity. Again.
So that's still kind of up for grabs on that. But again, we can say that this has nothing to do, it is a logical fallacy to think that this has anything to do with human-chimp ancestry.
I've already covered that, so all I have to say to Georgia is cope and seethe more, loser. Your ideas are demonstrably dumb, your ideology is shrinking, and the kids don't take you seriously.
All right, question 3. And I might say, do shared ancient repetitive elements support common ancestry? Okay.
Yes, they do.
What is an ancient repetitive element? Well, we're going to get to that. But this is an interesting question. Michael Shermer, who is the head of the Skeptic Society,
and who's been credibly accused of sexual abuse, so, you know.
President of that and publisher of Skeptic Magazine, actually came to the Creation Museum.
Ew, gross. I hope they disinfected it. And you know who knows to disinfect things that need it? Like anything that came in contact with Richard Dawkins? That's right, it's my channel members. Why not consider joining them with the join button below this video? It starts at just $1.99 a month, and you get early access to videos like this, as well as recognition in the live chats and access to my Discord server that's just for supporters.
A few months ago, back in March, he interviewed me, and if you want to watch the interaction there...
I absolutely do not. This actually makes me feel bad for Georgia, which is weird, because she's not the good guy here. She's just not, to my knowledge, someone who's been credibly accused of sexual abuse.
You can Google it or you can look at it on YouTube and you'll find it there. It was an interesting exchange, but this was one of the questions that he asked me. And so I decided, wow, that's definitely going to be one of the ones that I put in my presentation. So I thank him for that. The facts are, we do have repetitive elements. There's no doubt about that. And what are these repetitive elements? They compose 50% of our DNA is repetitive. Okay? It's the same kind of thing over and over again.
And most of it is functionless, and therefore junk. It's not regulatory, it's not coding, it's not anything. It's just genomic parasites, basically bits of DNA that do nothing but get duplicated, thereby spreading through the genome uselessly.
45% of that's considered transposons, or what we call jumping genes.
I don't like that name since they're generally not genes. Genes are things that code for proteins, and they don't as a rule.
3% are repeats of less than 100 base pairs, so they're not very big, but certain segments that are repeated. And 5% are duplications of large segments of DNA. Again, this is what we see, okay? This is a fact, okay? This is what we can actually observe in the human genome.
It sure is, and it's hard to imagine why you do that if you were intelligently designing a genome. It would be kind of like writing code and then just having, quote, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," end quote, in the comments in your code as about half the code. Like, sure, it's not really hurting anything, but why would you do that?
But the real question is, though, how did it get there? Okay, how did we get all of these repetitive elements?
Because they induce duplication of the repeat during DNA replication.
And that's where the word ancient comes in here, okay? Ancient repetitive elements and evolution. They're considered ancient because they find them in lower organisms.
No, it's because we find them distributed in ways that build nested hierarchies across wide swaths of life, including in very distantly related taxa, like different phyla. Further, there is no such thing as a lower form of life. That's an outdated and semi-religious idea that dates back to the great chain of being that goes all the way back to Greek philosophy. Evolution just preserves those organisms that reproduce. It doesn't have some goal of climbing a great ladder of existence. A flatworm isn't any higher or lower than a gorilla. They're just different. You're welcome to like one more than the other, but science doesn't put them in some kind of hierarchy.
So you might see the same thing in a mouse, or you might see the same thing in a dog, or a bacteria, or whatever, and the same thing in us.
It's not just that. It's that you'll see the least common repetitive elements between a human and a bacterium, then more with a dog, then even more with a mouse. And you can do that with basically all species, and you'll get a nested hierarchy. But these elements are largely non-functional, so they can't be preserved because of selection. Selection largely does not act on repetitive elements, which means that either God decided to put a hierarchical pattern of junk in genomes as a bit of a goof to trick us into believing in common ancestry, or common ancestry is in fact real. As much as I find him distasteful, Schirmer is not wrong about this.
So they say, well, because you see them in lower organisms, they're ancient.
Nope, that's a straw man. A really bad one. But hey, why would I expect Georgia to be honest? She already rejected literally everything about genetics, her own field of expertise.
That's their philosophy on that.
No, it's not any kind of philosophy. It's Georgia making stuff up.
The other thing is, and this is really problematic, they say they're not functional. They are merely evolutionary leftovers from our ancient past as we've evolved from one organism to another.
Because they're not functional in any significant way. If Georgia would like to propose a function for repetitive elements broadly, I'd love to hear it. But I suspect she will find a function for some former repetitive elements and then pretend that she can extend that to all of them. But that's not how thinking or science or anything else works.
And that organisms that have a recent common ancestor, like humans and chimps, or even mice and humans, should have very similar ancient repetitive elements.
Yeah, because genetics are passed from ancestor to descendant, and there are changes along the way, so the more closely related two organisms are, the more similar their genomes will be, and vice versa. The only other option is that genomes are not passed on from ancestor to descendant, but we know that they are. There are no other options than that genetic similarity is a measure, albeit an imperfect one, of relatedness.
Again, that whole idea of if they're similar, we must have a common ancestor.
Yeah, that assumption that, genetics is a thing. How dare we assume things like that the genotype affects phenotype, or that offspring inherit their genomes from their parents?
And so there's two issues we need to deal with here. First of all, are they or are they not functional?
The overwhelming majority are non-functional. A small subset have undergone mutations that made them functional in some organisms. Those functions are sequence-dependent and subject to selection, which allows us to tell which repeats are functional and which are not.
Because that's an important thing to talk about. And secondly, if they are similar, does that imply common ancestry?
Yes, because unlike Georgia, we are not going to deny the very most basic facts of genetics.
So that's what we're going to look at. But first, the issue of functionality. And I'm going to share with you some quotes. And we're going to talk a lot about some quotes from The Language of God, which was written by Dr. Francis Collins, who is a theistic evolutionist.
And former director of the NIH and a victim of a rabid fascist hate mob. Compared to Schirmer, this guy is a saint. Not that I think he's perfect or anything, but no accusations of sexual misconduct that I know of, and a long-standing effort to improve the public health of not just the United States, but the human species broadly makes him a good egg in my book.
And we get a lot of questions about him recently, and so I wanted to share some information from his book so that we can better understand this. He's just recently been appointed to head up the National Institutes of Health, and he played a major role in the Human Genome Project. So he's a very well-respected and well-known scientist, so a lot of people pay attention to what he says.
All fair and all true.
Well, he said in his book, mammalian genomes are littered with such AREs, with roughly 45% of the human genomes made up of such genetic flotsam and jetsam. When I first read that, I thought, what is flotsam and jetsam? I'm not familiar with that.
That's the name of Ursula's pet eels in the Disney movie The Little Mermaid, a movie which also features the voice of René Auberjonois, perhaps best known for portraying the changeling Odo on the television show Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where he is the head of station security.
It has to do with kinds of debris in the ocean, is what that is. So it's trash.
Hence the eels.
Basically, notice he says they're littered. Okay, so he's implying that they really don't have a function.
I think he's stating it pretty explicitly, not just implying.
But there's a problem with that, because repetitive elements are actually functional. They do have a function, and there is a lot of evidence to support that.
No, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that some small subset of them have function. It's kind of like going to a junkyard and then declaring that because you found a working spark plug to replace the faulty one in your car, that therefore all parts of all the cars in the whole junkyard are functional.
Even evidence that was out at the time that he wrote this particular book.
Yeah, and he was well aware of it. It's not news that some repeats have become functional. We've known that for decades, near as I can tell. But again, the fact that you've known for decades that sometimes you can find a functional car part at the junkyard doesn't mean that all the parts in all the cars have been functional the whole time.
So I want to share with you a quote concerning that functionality of sequences in the human genome. It says, while less than 1.5% of the mammalian genome encodes proteins or is genes, it is now evident that the vast majority is transcribed, mainly into non-protein coding RNA. So it's made from DNA into RNA.
Yes. In fact, last I saw, transcription occurs in some like 80-ish% of the genome. But just transcription is not evidence of function. Spurious transcription occurs all the time because it takes energy to prevent transcription. And so the cost of preventing all unnecessary transcription far outweighs the cost of the occasional spurious transcription. So some non-coding transcripts are functional for things like regulatory functions. So it's not the case that all non-coding transcripts are functionless, but it's also the case that many are. And most parts of the genome that are transcribed at levels of less than one transcript per cell at any given time. That's not going to be functional. Further, the functional transcripts are functional based on the sequence of the transcript. But we know that most repeats are not sequence constrained, which means that they cannot be performing sequence-dependent functions. So, if Georgia wants to say that they have a function, she needs to provide one that is not sequence-dependent. But I bet she can't.
Not into proteins, it just stays as RNA, doing something as RNA.
That something, in some cases, is just being broken down again without doing anything in particular. And for some of it, it's a regulatory function.
This raises the question of what fraction of the genome is functional.
About 20% max, probably more like 12%.
Many of the observed non-coding transcripts, or RNAs, are differentially expressed. I mean, they're expressed differently in the brain than the liver. And while most have not yet been studied, increasing numbers are shown to be functional.
In any given cell, only a small subset of the DNA will be transcribed at all. Of the non-coding transcripts that exist in a given cell, most will be functional, but they will also be transcripts of a small fraction of the genome. The majority of the genome will not be transcribed at all in any given cell, and those bits that are almost never transcribed will generally not be functional when they are, because again, spurious transcription is a thing. Transcription does not equal function, although generally function requires transcription. It's kind of like water. You need water to drink, but not all the water out there is being drunk by anyone, and most of it can't be drunk at all, because it's too salty, polluted, or both. So yeah, drinking requires water, like function requires transcription. But seeing transcription does not mean you can automatically infer function, just like seeing water does not automatically imply you can take a drink.
Thus, it is likely that much more than 5% of the genome encodes functional information, and although the upper bound is unknown, it may be considerably higher than currently thought.
Yeah, it's certainly much higher than 5%. Like I said, I think probably 12% is where the evidence currently points. That's 240% more. But even if all of the extra 7 percentage points of function was all in repeats, which we know it's not, that would still mean that most repeats are non-functional. The fraction of the genome that it represents is far too high for even half of it to be functional.
And so it's not an evolutionary leftover, but rather it's very, very important. It's a functional part of our genome.
In fact, all of it is evolutionary leftovers, but a tiny fraction of it has acquired function. In fact, since we know where repeats come from, that is, the copying of other non-functional repeats more times in the daughter genome than they existed in the parent genome, which just results in more useless DNA, the very fact that any of them are functional at all seems like a pretty obvious gain of function. That seems like it would be a gain of information under most useful definitions of information. Talking about this is just shooting anti-evolutionism in the foot once you actually know more than what the creationists lie to you about. And I want to be clear, I am not saying that Georgia is just mistaken. She has the education to know what she's talking about and to get it right. The only way she could be saying the things she's saying now is by ignoring that education, ignoring the things she knows to be true. It's not as blatant as Andrew Snelling covering up stress fractures in rock by hiding them behind his students, but it's also not that far off. It would be like if I started telling you that actually dinosaurs ancestrally have only one toe. You know I know better, and you know that there's no way for me to not know that that statement is false. And if I say it in an earnest attempt to convince people that it's true, then that's lying.
And next I want to share with you some research that was done by Dr. Richard Sternberg. Now that name might sound familiar to you.
It sure does.
If you've seen the movie Expelled, he was one of the first scientists that was interviewed in that particular movie, and he's associated with the intelligent design movement because he ran into some problems when he actually published one of their papers in a journal that he looked at.
Wow, that is a description that leaves out some important details. So Richard Sternberg was the editor of the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, a peer-reviewed journal obviously focusing on biology. Richard Sternberg published a literature review by Stephen C. Meyer, whom I've covered on this channel and who has said absurd things like that animals arose in the Cambrian and that mammals arose in the Eocene. He is also either astoundingly bad at math or just a liar. I'm not positive which one. Now, Stephen C. Meyer can absolutely publish in that journal, and I have no problem with him doing so, provided he can pass peer review. Therein lies the problem, though. Meyer's article was not given to any reviewers save Sternberg himself. That alone, regardless of the content of Meyer's article, is a violation not only of ethics, but also Sternberg's basic job description. This is just like if you were the quality control guy at a factory and you decided that since the latest batch of widgets was produced by Teddy and you really think Teddy is swell, that you don't really have to inspect that batch. You can just approve them to be shipped. It doesn't actually matter if Teddy's product is good. You still decided to not do the exact thing you were hired to do. And also, given that for all you know, Teddy's widgets might explode or something, it was an unethical thing to do. You should expect to be fired if you did that. Well, guess what? Sternberg was justly fired. So that's the real story. Sternberg refused to do his job and violated ethical standards to help a friend out. That his friend is a massive piece of shit that works for a fascist propaganda outlet is just shit icing on the turd cake that is Sternberg.
And so what he decided to do was kind of have a compilation of all these repetitive elements and see, are they functional, are they doing something, drawing from the literature that's out there. And you know what? Now I know you can't read this, and I don't expect you to, but he came up with repetitive element after repetitive element after repetitive element that has a known function. Table after table after table, okay?
Yeah, okay, the genome is very big. There's no surprise that if you wanted to catalog all the regions of repetitive elements that have gained some function, that it would take you a fair few pages. The same is true for any class of functional DNA. But what percentage of the repetitive elements in the human genome does that encompass? Yeah, it's almost none. Remember, repetitive elements are about 2/3 of the human genome. So in a haploid genome, there are about 3 billion base pairs, or 6 billion in the diploid genome, but we'll stick with haploid. So that means that there are 2 billion base pairs or so worth of repetitive elements. So if we rather generously assume that 5% of that is functional, and that each functional region is about 5,000 base pairs, that would still be 150,000 repetitive segments of the genome. Of course, it would take up many tables and pages, but it's still a very small fraction, and the fraction is not even close to that high. And the thing is, the proposed functions are still sequence dependent, which means that those functional parts of the repetitive elements have to be sequence constrained and therefore under selection pressure. But we know that that's not true for most of the repetitive parts of the genome, which means that not only are they not functional in any of the ways that Sternberg has documented, but they can't have other sequence-dependent functions either.
So a lot of these elements do have a particular function.
A lot if you decide to count them one at a time, but not a lot if you're looking at the whole category of DNA and comparing functional fraction to the whole.
He went on to say this: our expectation is that one day we will think of what used to be called junk DNA, or these repetitive elements, as a critical component of truly expert cellular control regimes. I like that word, expert, okay?
And in some more than 20 years since, that hasn't happened. The majority of the repetitive elements are not just of no known function, but of known no function. Sternberg was wrong, just like creationists have been wrong for decades when they say that evolution is a theory in crisis.
Intelligently designed by the creator God to do something in our genome.
Since Georgia likes to play the fallacy game, I just want to point out that going from some repetitive elements have a documented function to therefore God designed all of them is what we in the biz call a
non sequitur.
So even though Collins does not admit the functionality of AREs,
well, since most of them are known not to have function, and I don't think he's required to give every possible caveat every time he speaks, I'm not sure that's an accurate characterization of him. Like, if I said that fruit is sweet, that's a true statement, even though it's not really true of all fruit. For example, jalapenos are not really sweet, but they're fruit. But me not talking about the long list of exceptions that still are not the majority doesn't mean that I don't admit that non-sweet fruit exists. There's this thing called the principle of charity, and you might not know it, but I practice it perhaps to excess with the creationists. The idea is that you try to give the most reasonable interpretation of what someone is saying. So if someone says AREs are functionless, you should interpret that as shorthand for the majority of AREs are functionless, and that typifies that class of DNA, but there are exceptions to the rule as there are to most rules in biology. Georgia claims to follow a guy who is pretty into charity, and so perhaps could stand to implement the principle of charity herself.
He does think they're important, especially important when it comes to the issue of common ancestry.
Well, given that nearly all of them are not sequence constrained and hence not subject to natural selection, a hierarchy based off of them will not exist due to natural selection sending non-descent-based signals to your phylogenetic analysis, which makes them excellent parts of the genome to do phylogenetics on. And we know what the analysis would look like if the organisms were all created separately, even if they were created with identical neutral variation. It would mostly just be a bunch of polytomies, and it would not map well onto the hierarchies made with character traits from the phenotype. We actually can test for separate versus common ancestry. Both make obvious predictions. Turns out the predictions of separate ancestry never really turn up, whereas those of common ancestry do. It's almost like common ancestry is the better model when it comes to predicting future data. Well, I mean, it's exactly like that. And I realize that I may need to describe a polytomy. So if we assume common descent, then generally we should expect that in reality, splits within a taxon should always be binary, with only very rare exceptions. As a result, most techniques to determine the phylogeny of organisms try to only have branches that split into two daughter branches. But sometimes, as a result of things like incomplete lineage sorting, temporally close divergence of multiple lineages, or just incomplete datasets, we can get situations where there is no statistically significantly more likely tree shape for 3 or more taxa, and so they all emerge from a single node. This is called a polytomy. In separate ancestry, lineages cannot inherit mutations from ancestors with other lineages, since no such ancestors ever existed. This means that most nodes should be polytomies if you were to try to figure out the most likely ancestral tree, because there never was an ancestral tree.
And he says this: when one aligns sections of the human and mouse genome anchored by the appearance of gene counterparts that occur in the same order, one can usually also identify AREs in approximately the same location in these two genomes. So he said, if you have gene A and gene B, and you match them up, in between there's this ARE, okay, this repetitive element. And you can see that over and over and over again.
Which there's no reason for under intelligent design, because remember, these things are overwhelmingly functionless. And in mice specifically, there have been knockout tests where large sections of the genome have been removed, sections that have positive evidence for the lack of function. And those newly lighter mice are born, grow up, and are perfectly happy, healthy mice, who can go on to have happy, healthy pups. And yes, a baby mouse is called a pup. If you're thinking they're called pinkies, that's true, but only until their hair comes in.
So he goes on to say, okay, he thinks this is really important. Of course, some might argue that these are actually functional elements placed there by the creator for a good reason, and our discounting of them as junk DNA just betrays our current level of ignorance. And indeed, some small fraction of them may play important regulatory roles.
Well, now we know that Collins does not deny that there are functional regions that are part of repetitive elements of the genome. So when Georgia said otherwise, she was lying, since she's the one who prepared these slides and this talk. Good to know.
But certain examples severely strain the credulity of that explanation.
Why do I feel like we're not going to examine the examples in this talk, but that Collins did in his book? I don't know. Maybe it's just my years of experience with creationist output on the one hand and honest scientific writing on the other.
Okay, so what he's saying is that, he goes on to then say basically that a lot of these repetitive elements are damaged, defunct, and decapitated. And those are the 3 words that he likes to use.
Good alliteration. Not sure that I know what decapitated means in this context, though.
But does he really know that?
Yes, he does.
Absolutely not. It is completely based on what we call a prejudicial conjecture.
Do you think Georgia knows that all throwing around these $5 words does is make her seem pretentious, since she's obviously wrong and in many cases lying?
That most of what is called junk DNA really is junk. Why does he think that? Because of his evolutionary starting point.
Nope, it's because we can test for it. I've already described knockout tests and checking for selection pressure, so I won't go back over those now. But the fact is that DNA is not assumed to be junk until we find a function. No assumption is made if we don't know if a region of DNA has function or not. Suppose you run a company that operates themed attractions, and you'd like to open up an Old West mining town themed attraction. There's a ghost town that is currently on state-owned land in some Midwest state in the former United States. It was built in 1884, and luckily for you, it had indoor plumbing. But it's now 2026, and this place was abandoned in 1932, so those pipes have been sitting there for nearly a century, 94 years. So you buy the land, and when fixing it up for your themed attraction, you get a hookup to the nearest water main and have a contract with the city that operates it to pay them for water at your park. So the next thing you decide to do is close the main shutoff valve to the park and turn on the various taps and faucets just a little bit, then open the valve. Some of the taps come on and some don't. You mark the ones that don't as non-functional and the ones that do as functional. You have done a function test. You have positive evidence of function and of non-function. You didn't assume non-function or function. That's what is going on in the genome. There is no default to non-function assumption. We can and do check for both function and non-function. Once again, it is hard to believe that Georgia is ignorant of both the ability of geneticists to do knockout tests and of them to check for selection pressure in various regions of the genome.
This is what you would expect to see. There should be junk. There should be remnants of the past.
True, and there is. That's what we call a confirmed prediction.
And indeed, that's what you see. And because it's a remnant of the past and we no longer need it, it's become damaged, defunct, and decapitated.
Pretty much, but of course, that's not an assumption. We checked.
Now, again, he doesn't actually know that.
Yeah, he does, and I think Georgia knows that he does.
Okay? He's just conjecturing that.
Nope, he's reporting on the consensus that has been formed as a result of many experiments that detected overwhelming positive evidence for lack of function in the vast majority of the genome of humans and closely related organisms like rodents. In case you didn't know, rodents and lagomorphs are a sister group to the primates and colugos. That's why rodents and lagomorphs are so often used as lab animals. They are the closest relatives to humans that are easy to keep and breed in captivity. Closer analogs like monkeys are a lot harder to maintain, and they breed much more slowly.
And again, even though we've only studied a minority of these elements, those tables showed you that they do have a function, and our knowledge is continuing to increase in there. They are indeed functional.
And yet, here we are some 17 years later, and we have tested more AREs, and the consensus remains the same. The overwhelming majority are functionless, even if you can fill a fair few pages explaining exceptions to that rule. As a fun exercise, watch some old creationist output like this, and then listen to their predictions and check to see if they came true. They almost never do. In fact, I'm not aware of any that have, but I haven't checked all of them.
Now, he goes on to say, after quite a little bit about talking about these damaged, things in our genome, he goes on to say, unless one is willing to take the position that God has placed these decapitated AREs in these precise positions to confuse and mislead us, the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. This kind of recent genome data thus presents an overwhelming challenge to those who hold to the idea that all species were created ex nihilo.
You know, I have a few complaints about Collins, but overall he always seemed like a decent fellow. This makes me like him all the more.
Wow, okay, that's a power-packed paragraph, and we're going to take it apart piece by piece here.
I'm sure she is, but can she do it honestly?
So the first part, he's basically saying common ancestry or evolution is true simply because God wouldn't have done it that way, okay?
That's not the only reason. It's also the case that we can actually phylogenetically analyze these regions, and we know how to detect separate and common ancestry, since they make opposite predictions about the shapes of the resultant trees and their statistical significance. So while why would God trick us is a perfectly valid question, and any answer other than he wouldn't makes knowledge completely impossible and should be rejected on those grounds alone, we also have positive evidence of common ancestry and positive evidence against separate ancestry with just this alone.
He wouldn't have had these AREs in the same place, in the same genomes, in different organisms. He just wouldn't have done it that way.
I mean, not unless God is a divine trickster who wants us to believe false things. There's no reason those junk regions have to exist at all, and certainly no reason they have to match across taxa with the degree to which they match corresponding to other measurements of relatedness, such that they form their own independent test of common ancestry that lines up with morphological, fossil, and other genetic lines of evidence. Doing all that despite separate ancestry is just a lie from God. By the way, this is the same reason most creationists do not accept that fossils were planted in the ground at creation, because it would make God a liar.
Okay, now, again, he says, especially if they're damaged, there's no way. Now, how does he know what God would do?
Collins is, by all accounts, a fairly orthodox Christian with a small o. He believes in things like the Trinity, the omnibenevolence and omnipotence of God, and while omniscience is a standard attribute of God in small o Orthodox Christianity, it means different things to different theologians, so I won't touch that one. This means that he has assumed that God is all good, and it seems incompatible with that idea for God to have arranged for the world to point to a history that did not exist in ways that are not necessary. To believe otherwise is to mean that God is happy to deceive the whole world at a large scale. At that point, even if the Bible really is the Word of God, it's the word of a known liar God and should not be trusted for that very reason. His reasons are theological, but they're really the only theological conclusion to come to that lets the small o Orthodox Christian worldview be internally consistent, given the information at hand. I'm not here to defend any Christian worldview or any other worldview per se, but since that question was raised, that's my answer.
Now, I agree he wouldn't put damaged, information in there in the same place, in the same organisms. He didn't do that. That's a result of the fall. If they are no longer functional, that's something that's happened as a result of the passage of time.
See, there's a problem there, though, because the damage also falls into a nested hierarchy. Lineages far larger than anything answers in Genesis would accept as a single created kind have shared damaged DNA. For example, all primates have the same damage to their gulo gene, rendering them unable to synthesize vitamin C. When we see patterns that are only predicted by common descent and are precluded by separate ancestry, and Georgia says that they are the result of the fall, then it means that organisms that share any damage to their formerly functional DNA regions and share the same breakage with the wide group of organisms must, by Georgia's own logic, be related by common ancestry. So guess what? That unites all primates, humans included, into a group with common ancestry. I guess maybe Adam was actually a Plesiodapus.
But he's being completely arbitrary.
No, he's just trying to have a consistent worldview, something Georgia might want to try sometime.
How does he know? He doesn't.
I agree, he doesn't know, but he has the advantage of his view of biology not contradicting either the evidence of biology or the attributes he accepts as belonging to the Creator. Georgia doesn't have that advantage, so either she has to reject evidence from biology or reject aspects of the Creator. She has chosen to reject evidence.
Obviously, it would never be to mislead or confuse us because God does not lie. He doesn't do that to us.
So we can't blame God for creating primates with a broken vitamin C synthesis gene. That had to happen after the fall. So all primates have common ancestry according to this line of reasoning.
But can't the divine creator God use similar parts in similar organisms?
Sure, in fact, that is what we should expect. Reusing parts that work across life. For example, we should expect that the best wings should be shared across all the flying organisms, except that bat, bird, pterosaur, and insect wings are all wildly different. Or to be a bit crass, why do reptiles and mammals both have penises, but penises that derive from entirely different embryonic tissue and even have different fluids that fill their erectile tissue, with blood in mammals and lymphatic fluid in reptiles? God doesn't seem to be doing what Georgia predicts. Instead, anatomical novelties are taxonomically restricted, as if God just wants us to accept common ancestry because he's a liar, or as if common ancestry actually occurred. And furthermore, that's why Collins is concentrating on junk regions, because they aren't functional elements that one might expect God to reuse in the first place.
I mean, animals and man, especially mice and humans, we are both mammals. Can't he do that?
Sure, but we're not talking about functional parts. That's sort of the point.
Absolutely, he can do that. He is a logical, orderly God, and that's what we would expect.
And it's not actually what we find for the most part, so prediction failed. The null hypothesis is not rejected.
From him, and that's exactly what we see.
Boy, was I wrong.
So, going on now, he says the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. See that term again, kind of like Ken Miller used. There's no doubt about it.
Certainly not any reasonable doubt, no. But people are not always reasonable, and as evidence, I present our speaker, Georgia Purdom.
But once again, our friend, the logical fallacy. Okay, he's affirming the consequent.
No, he's not, because he is being empirical, not strictly adhering to formal logic, like all science. And further, he is investigating alternative explanations and precluding them, which means he's double not affirming the consequent. Let's skip past Georgia once again deciding that she just hates science for the very nature of what it is, and she would seemingly prefer that science simply not exist.
We have a common designer God who probably put them there for a very good reason, and we need to figure that out.
Even if that's true, it still leaves humans with a common ancestor with marmosets by Georgia's logic.
We need to do that. And as creationists, you know what? We have a reason to do that because we believe that God designed it that way.
Cool. Stop fundraising for things like buildings shaped like imaginary boats or replicating a ziggurat in Kentucky. And do some research. Get real data. Be rigorous about it. Publish the work. Go do it. We know that they won't, though, because creationist research isn't aimed at increasing knowledge or discovering anything about the world. It's performative LARP with the goal of having something to show scientifically illiterate donors that looks like scientific research in the same way that that one AI picture of a room looks like a room, except that when you look closer, nothing actually makes sense. Just like when you look closer at creationist papers, nothing really makes sense.
But the evolutionists, they don't really have a reason to do it because after all, it's just an evolutionary leftover, right? Why bother?
And yet they do. The entire point of the ENCODE project was to figure out what, if anything, every part of the human genome does. Real scientists are doing the work, even the work that Georgia is requesting that they do.
That's prohibiting science, whereas we as creationists are progressing science because we see that as the result of God and we want to study it and we want to figure out what it's doing.
Literally the opposite of what's going on. Scientists are investigating precisely what Georgia wants investigated, and in doing so, aren't disparaging the whole basis for science. Meanwhile, creationists LARP violate ethical standards and dismiss the very basic idea of empiricism. At the risk of dipping too much into therapy speak, it seems like we have some projection going on.
Now, the very last argument he says here, he says this is an overwhelming challenge to those who hold to the idea that all species were created ex nihilo.
And yeah, most creationists are not species-level creationists, so this is a bit of a straw man. We're skipping Georgia whining about it because the fact is that if he had said family, he'd be just as right, and that's roughly where creationists of Georgia's ilk tend to put creation.
It says he created kinds ex nihilo. He created the different kinds, which we believe is about the family level of classification, not genus, not species, but family.
Yeah, because just by a wild coincidence, humans who have arbitrarily defined families based on just vibes, and I'm not kidding here, what counts as a family is really a vibe check, have managed to arbitrarily and accidentally land on what the created kinds actually are. For example, the order Crocodilia contains 3 families, Gavialidae, Crocodilidae, and Alligatoridae. Why is it only 3? It could just be 1. There's no reason. That's just how scientists like it. Alternatively, caimans could be their own family separate from alligators, and we'd have 4. There would be nothing wrong with that. Alternatively, again, we could just as well combine Gavialidae and Crocodilidae into just one family and have 2 families. All of these options are equally valid, because what a family is arbitrary. So if taxonomists can arbitrarily decide where the family is, which they do in every single case, then how could that possibly correspond to kinds? Could I create a brand new created kind with retrocausality by just convincing taxonomists to set caimans in their own family? Of course not. If special creation is true and it is above the species level where we find the separate creations, then it should be more or less random if the kind corresponds to an order, a family, a genus, a species, or any of the steps between, like infraorder or subfamilies.
Okay, so again, that's the problem with that type of argument. He's setting up a straw man.
Except that, it works just fine if he uses family instead of species, so the argument still needs to be addressed.
So what can we say?
Well, given that she's willing to lie, she can say more or less anything. It's just that there's an almost 100% chance that whatever she is about to say is something we can conclusively show is wrong, if we haven't already.
Well, we can say that junk DNA is not junk.
As already shown, that's extremely wrong.
And we really need to rename that. We've got to figure out a better term to use for that because it's just very problematic.
It already has another name, non-functional DNA. Georgia doesn't like that name any better because it's not that she doesn't like the name, she doesn't like the reality.
Shared AREs are not evidence for common ancestry.
They are, unless God is a liar.
That is a logical fallacy.
Georgia likes sextupling down on her rejection of all science.
And those that argue who God wouldn't have done it that way are being completely arbitrary.
Nope, they're just maintaining an epistemologically consistent theology that doesn't reject biology. They don't really have any other options besides rejecting science that leaves them with any epistemology at all.
And a common designer equals common designs.
Implying that separate design implies separate designers. And if life is designed, we clearly see separate design. So either Georgia has to accept many creators, or it's time for her to drop this argument.
All right, now we go to question, I'm losing track here, 4.
But question 4 is for next time, as is question 5. This video is already quite long as it is, so let's reconvene in a week or so. If you liked this video, please hit like and let me know what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, I hope you subscribe and check out the channel memberships and my Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above.
Siloof, Benthovend, Tapioca Weasel, Sphincter of Doom, Regios, Landon, Ian Chen, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Kelvin Brostok von Manen, David Hercules, Joshua Geese, Pegajace, The Plastic Mouse, Arrow Dodger, Gordon Love Science, Ember Athelian, Prixie Purple, Agricola Siqua, Me, Myself, and I, Edwin M., Kenneth Swenson, Lance Hall, and John Ackerman.
It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 15% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.